The Galactic Council had seen many species rise and fall across the cosmos, but nothing had prepared them for the humans. When the USS Prometheus first docked at Station Kepler 442, Ambassador Zethkar of the Vortanian Empire had expected another predictable first contact, trade agreements, territorial negotiations, the usual diplomatic dance that had played out thousands of times before. What he witnessed instead defied every protocol in the Council's archives. The human delegation had barely settled into their quarters when reports began flooding in from the station's lower levels. The Shadowkin, ancient creatures of living darkness that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, had somehow infiltrated the station's maintenance sectors. These beings were pure nightmare fuel, writhing masses of void black tentacles that fed on fear and left behind only desiccated husks where sentient beings once stood. Standard protocol demanded immediate evacuation. The Vortanians powered up their plasma cannons. The crystalline Zephirites began charging their energy shields. Even the usually peaceful Aquarians retreated to their environmental pods, sealing themselves away from the approaching horror. But the humans? They grabbed what appeared to be food containers and walked directly toward the threat. Captain Sarah Chen led the small group, her expression more curious than concerned. Behind her, Dr. Marcus Webb carried a large cooler, while Engineer Rosa Martinez hefted what looked suspiciously like a portable barbecue grill. "Ambassador," Captain Chen had said to the bewildered Zethkar, "mind if we borrow your mess hall for a bit? We're going to need some space." What happened next would be debated in xenobiological circles for centuries. The humans didn't fight the Shadowkin. They didn't run from them. Instead, they set up their equipment in the lower levels and began cooking. The aroma of seared meat and exotic spices filled the corridors, creating an atmosphere so incongruous with impending doom that even the Shadowkin seemed momentarily confused. Captain Chen approached the largest of the creatures, a writhing mass of darkness roughly the size of a small starship. The thing towered over her, tendrils of pure void reaching out to drain her life force. She looked up at it with the same expression one might use when meeting a neighbor's dog. "You look hungry," she said simply, offering up a plate of what the ship's manifest later revealed to be Texas barbecue brisket with homemade sauce. The Shadowkin paused. In 3 million years of recorded galactic history, nothing had ever offered a Shadowkin food. They were creatures of pure consumption, devourers of life and light. They didn't eat, they absorbed. But humans, as the galaxy was rapidly learning, had a tendency to ignore what was supposed to be impossible. The creature's tendrils wrapped around the plate with what could only be described as curiosity. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly the food began to disappear, not absorbed into darkness, but actually consumed in a way that suggested genuine appreciation. Dr. Webb stepped forward with scientific enthusiasm that completely ignored the fact he was addressing a cosmic horror. "Fascinating. Your bioenergy signature suggests you're running on pure fear consumption, but that's incredibly inefficient. Have you ever considered supplementing with actual nutrients? The protein in this brisket could provide—" "Marcus," Captain Chen interrupted gently, "maybe save the lecture until after we're not potentially being murdered." But the Shadowkin wasn't attacking. If anything, it seemed to be purring. The sound was like distant thunder mixed with contentment, a deep rumble that resonated through the station's hull. Over the next several hours, something unprecedented unfolded. The humans shared their food, their stories, and their inexplicable ability to find common ground with beings that had been considered irredeemably hostile for eons. They learned that the Shadowkin weren't inherently evil. They were starving refugees from a dying dimension, consuming fear because it was the only energy source they'd found that could sustain them in this reality. "That's terrible, Engineer," Martinez had said, ladling another portion of her grandmother's pozole into a makeshift feeding trough. "No wonder you're all so grumpy. Fear's gotta be like cosmic junk food, right? All empty calories." The largest Shadowkin, who had begun responding to the name Shadow, much to the horror of the assembled diplomatic corps, extended a tendril that somehow conveyed agreement and gratitude in equal measure. 3 months later, Ambassador Zethkar filed the most unusual report in Council history. The Shadowkin had not only ceased their attacks on galactic shipping lanes, they had become the most effective patrol force the galaxy had ever seen. Turns out creatures that could exist in the void between stars made excellent guardians against actual threats. Pirates found themselves facing beings that could phase through hulls and disable weapon systems with thought alone. But instead of the terror and death that had once followed Shadowkin encounters, these criminals found themselves gently but firmly deposited at the nearest Council security station, often with handwritten notes from their captors, apologizing for any inconvenience. The humans had established what they called feeding stations throughout the galaxy, regular supply drops of proper nutrition that kept the Shadowkin healthy and happy. In return, the former monsters served as an invisible protective net, watching over trade routes and responding to distress calls with efficiency that made the Council's official fleet look sluggish by comparison. How? Zethkar had finally asked Captain Chen during one of their regular diplomatic dinners. How did you know that would work? Chen had smiled, the same expression she'd worn when approaching a cosmic horror with barbecue sauce. Back home, we have a saying, the way to anyone's heart is through their stomach. We figured it was worth a shot. But they were Shadowkin, the ambassador protested, primordial forces of destruction. They were hungry, Dr. Webb corrected, looking up from his notes. Everything makes more sense when you're not hangry. As reports continued to arrive of former galactic terrors now serving as gentle guardians, all because some humans had decided to share their lunch, the Council began to realize they weren't just dealing with another species. They were dealing with humans. And somehow, that was both the most terrifying and most hopeful thought in the galaxy.